as I say, I will go to my deathbed knowing I may not have accomplished anything in affecting change, but I will know that at least I went up to bat and took my swings. I may strike out, but that's much better than being afraid to step into the batter's box in the first place.
Paging Dr. Cook. Paging Dr. Cook. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR. Dr. Cook, you're wanted in the OR.
Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prescription for Success. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, your host for the podcast, which is a production of MD Coaches, providing leadership and executive coaching for physicians by physicians. To overcome burnout, transition your career, develop as a leader, or whatever your goal might be, visit MD Coaches on the web at mymdcoaches.com. Because you're not in this alone. My guest today recently retired after 28 years in a very successful rheumatology practice, but he's continuing to have a big impact on healthcare issues as an activist and as an author with a new book called Rheum for Improvement. That's R-H-E-U-M, Rheum for Improvement. So let's hear my conversation with Dr. Mark Lopatin. Well, I'm looking forward to a really great conversation today with Dr. Mark Lopatin, who is a recently retired rheumatologist. Mark, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Mark has a terrific book that I have read most of. I was only able to acquire my copy just a few days ago, Mark, but parts of it that I have read are really very compelling, and we're going to spend some time talking about that. But as we always do on Prescription for Success, I want to begin with your beginnings. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in medicine and what your early days in training were like.
Well, realistically, there was no set incident that caused me to go into medicine. It was kind of understood from a young age that I was going to become a doctor. I was always strong in the sciences and math, and it just naturally led there. There was no one in my family who's a doctor, so I don't have a specific answer to how I went into medicine. I always wanted to, quote, help people, end quote, but I never really understood what that meant growing up. I really was kind of oblivious until I got to medical school and residency and even thereafter.
Did you learn anything from television doctors by any chance?
Oh, I watched Marcus Welby growing up, and the problem was always solved in half an hour, and he was a very caring doctor, and there was no bureaucracy, and it was totally unrealistic.
That's exactly right. Well, I apologize for the interruption. Go ahead and tell us about undergraduate school and getting into medical school.
Well, I went to college, went to medical school. Frankly, I was clueless. I knew nothing of bureaucracy. I grew up in the 60s, the time of the Vietnam War, the Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinations, Watergate, Kent State. And I knew nothing about these things. Growing up, my major interest was what were the Eagles going to do that year? And, how were the Phillies going to play that year? I was very into sports, and I was totally oblivious. I didn't become involved in anything political or anything involving advocacy until much later in my life. I was able to vote for the first time in 1976. I didn't even know what a Democrat or a Republican was. Didn't know the difference. In fact, I didn't learn that until I was in my 40s. Totally apolitical until various events in my life caused that to change.
Yeah, and I really do want to get into that, but I'm also curious to know that with that background, which I think is fairly common for people who were training in the 60s and 70s, as you and I were, but the experience of medical school once you were there, was it more or less like you expected, or were there some shocks at that point?
There was the first taste of bureaucracy, and there's all kinds of stories. I did part of my medical school training and my residency at the VA hospital. I often joke that the only reason the VA exists is so that we have stories to tell later on in life. But I began to get
great education.
But I began to get a taste of bureaucracy. I began to get a taste of how doctors are viewed. And it didn't really register with me at the time. It wasn't until I wrote the book that looking back on these incidents, that I realized, oh my God, this is what I could have learned from that. This is what by default learned from this. And I applied it later on in life. I didn't have conscious knowledge of the lessons I learned at the time that I learned them. I kind of swallowed them, but never really tasted them until much later on, when I really thought about what was going on and what I had experienced.
It's an interesting analogy. I'm also sort of fascinated about your selection of rheumatology as a specialty.
People always ask me why I went into rheumatology. And once again, it was an unconscious decision that fit perfectly with my personality. One, I love to solve puzzles and games. Rheumatology is all about solving difficult problems. Two, I'm not fast on my feet. I need time to digest, think things through. I would not have succeeded as an emergency room doc or as a surgeon, where decisions need to be made instantaneously. I do much better when I have a chance to process information. Furthermore, rheumatology gave me a chance to kind of get to know my patients. I tell the story of one patient whom I met when she was 25 or so. She was working independently. She had lupus, and I met her and diagnosed her. And then she announced to me that she met a guy, and then she got engaged, and then she got married. And then she had her first child, her second child. And I got to experience all this with her. And basically, I took care of her for 25 years and got to know her personally. And that personal aspect is very much a benefit to rheumatology. It's not so much of a benefit in some other specialties. And that was very attractive to me. Although, again, I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't realize it till much later, how much rheumatology fit with who I am.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, and I don't want to over-personalize the interview, but I had a career in surgery, and I didn't realize how much I missed the continuity of care over a long period of time until I stopped operating, and I became the medical director of a chronic wound care center. And it was much like rheumatology. The patients either never get completely healed or it takes a long time to do it, and I really found that much more satisfying. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, one of the things I point out in the book is what Samuel Shem talks about in The House of God. He talks about the art of medicine as, quote, being with, end quote, the patient. And that means sharing their life with them, sharing their ups and downs, being there with them, validating them. And, watching your patients have kids, being with them when they experience something great, a grandchild or a vacation, and also being there to console them when something bad happens, when their disease gets worse or we can't control it and they're in pain. And it's just that act of being with the patient, which is very conducive to good patient care. As I said, the caring may be more important than the curing. And that's especially true in rheumatology, because we don't have a lot of cures in rheumatology. Doesn't mean we can't help people, though.
So it sounds like that in that early part of your career, after you had finished your rheumatology fellowship and were beginning to establish yourself in practice, you probably felt like, at least in the beginning, that you were in exactly the right spot. And then you began to come face to face with some realities that I think a lot of us never expect. And I will let you pick up the story from there.
Well, I assume you're talking about the lawsuits.
That would be a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, I had 2 lawsuits within 2 months apart. The first one was a patient that I saw with fibromyalgia who did well. I saw her a total of 4 visits. I didn't have to do anything with her because her primary care doctor had started on a medicine and she did well on it. She later sued me for failure to diagnose her brain tumor. Now, keep in mind, as a rheumatologist, I'm a joint doctor. I don't diagnose brain tumors. And I had asked her the cardinal question of headache, which is the cardinal symptom of this particular type of brain tumor. She told me no. So basically, I got sued for failure to diagnose something outside my specialty in a patient who denied the cardinal symptom of that particular problem, even though I specifically asked. Right. The plaintiff's attorney could never get an expert to testify against me, and the case went on for 2 years before my attorney finally filed for contempt and the lawsuit was dropped. But I had 2 years of anxiety over that case. The other one was much worse. This was, again, a lady with fibromyalgia whom I treated, who developed hearing loss. She saw an ear, nose, and throat doctor in Philadelphia who diagnosed her with autoimmune sensory neurohearing loss. He put her on steroids, and she alleged that she had a side effect from those steroids. And I got named in the suit simply because I was a treating physician, even though I diagnosed the problem that she had, which was avascular necrosis, got her off the steroids very quickly, and basically did everything I was supposed to do. However, the ear, nose, and throat doctor was in Philadelphia, and the lawsuit was going to be taken to Philadelphia, which was well known as a judicial hellhole at the time. And my attorney said to me, your chart documentation is good. You have done nothing wrong. He said, now you need to settle this suit because none of that's going to matter to a jury in Philadelphia. And I had to face the difficult decision of whether to settle a lawsuit knowing I had done nothing wrong based on the circumstances, with the idea of how do I look my kids in the eye and tell them to fight for what's right when I'm giving in this particular case. Because of a number of other circumstances, I was at risk for being the sole provider in terms of paying off this case, and the risks were too great. So I ended up settling a lawsuit, and that affected me tremendously emotionally. In terms of future patients, I wondered if future patients were going to be potential plaintiffs. The patient-physician relationship was damaged to that, and I ultimately needed counseling to help me get through it.
That really is very understandable, everything that you're saying. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and amplify on that a little bit, because we have young physicians and even medical students that listen to this podcast from time to time. And I would like for you to talk a little bit about that incredible feeling of being the only person that this has ever happened to, when in reality there are people that have been frivolously or unnecessarily sued for malpractice all over the place. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, one of the things that this did was it spurred me on to become political for the first time in my life. And I joined a politically active physicians association. I began to get involved with political candidates who supported tort reform, and I began to look into the issue. I actually conducted a survey of over 1,000 physicians across the state of Pennsylvania and found that 70% of them reported having been sued at least at one point in their life, which was amazing, because one of the key things in this that you point to is the isolation, the sense that you're the only one who's ever gone through this. You're not allowed to talk about it. My partners only knew that I was being sued. They didn't know any of the details of it, and you're not allowed to share it with anybody. And there's a sense of feeling like you're inadequate, like you're a bad doctor. Even though I looked at the chart and knew I had done nothing wrong, there's still that feeling. There's also the feeling of being violated, of having been sued when you haven't done anything wrong and being taken advantage of. One of the things I preach to other physicians when I talk about this is the idea that for a lawyer, this is strictly business. This is nothing personal. And I preach to the lawyers, this is very personal. A couple comments on that. One, getting sued for malpractice is not the same as getting sued for a car accident. When you meet someone at a party, you initially judge them based on their age, you form impressions about that, you immediately learn their gender, you ask questions like, are you married? Do you have kids? One of the first questions you ask is, what kind of work do you do? Because the work that we do, our jobs, are part of our identity. Driving is not part of my identity. So when I get sued for a car accident, that's not a reflection on my character or my identity. Getting sued for malpractice is. It's deeply personal. But I tell physicians that for a lawyer, this is strictly business. I know of one case where, while the jury was out deliberating, the plaintiff's attorney approached the defendant and asked him if he would be an expert witness for another case he had. The lawyer had no qualms about the expertise of this physician. This is strictly a business proposition for an attorney, and it's nothing more than that. And if you can look at it that way as a physician, it takes the onus off of the personal nature of this.
But don't you think it's next to impossible for most physicians? I won't say all, but don't you think it's just nearly impossible for most physicians to be totally unable to not take this sort of thing as a personal assault on their integrity and their skill?
It's extremely, extremely difficult. I mean, the emotions override the logical part of it. And that's why I encourage physicians to try to use the logic, try to use their intellect to think this through, as opposed to the emotions, because the emotions are very strong. For the reasons I've outlined, it's traumatic. It is deeply traumatic. I mean, there's a form of post-traumatic stress disorder from this called medical malpractice stress syndrome. I'm convinced that I suffer from that, even though I've never been formally diagnosed. But it is a form of PTSD, and it's very, very difficult to get through. I was angry. I mean, I could not get the venom out of me for months or years. And even now, 20 years later, as I talk about this, I'm visibly shaking because of the emotional impact of it. But sometimes you can use intellect to help soften the emotional aspect of it. And that's what I try to tell physicians to do. But like I said, I needed counseling to help me get through this, to make me realize that I was not a bad person or a bad doctor just because this happened to me.
Well, it's a credit to you that you were able to come to that realization and take that step to take care of yourself. And I'm glad that you did that, and I appreciate you sharing that information with us. I want to move on to a slightly different topic. We've been talking about a venue, a style of life where getting into oppositional debates with other individuals is normal day-to-day business. And you've talked about very nicely how that's just the way they do business. But the next thing that you ran into after you were recovering from the civil bar is the Board of Medicine in Pennsylvania. And again, I'll just let you tell the story.
Well, if the prior lawsuits were a hurricane, my experience with the State Board of Medicine was a tsunami. It just blew me away. Basically, this was before the opioid crisis existed. State boards were starting to get concerned about opioids, and they were looking for a case. I had a patient who was a chronic pain patient who was on an opioid when I met her. I adjusted her dosage of medicines upward, as was the current teaching at the time. I put her on a long-acting medicine. At the time, pain was, quote, the fifth vital sign. Doctors were being accused of not treating pain aggressively enough. Addiction was viewed as a function of the patient rather than the drug. It was taught that there was no ceiling to opioid dosage, generally speaking. And I got my patient up to a very high dose of an opioid, OxyContin, and stabilized her. She was stable on that dose for 3 years with her pain much better controlled when she got admitted to the hospital for something else. And the doctor there questioned the diagnosis of fibromyalgia, said it didn't exist, and said she should not be on this much pain medicine. He was actually right.
He said that she didn't have fibromyalgia, or that there was no such thing?
No such thing. So he totally discounted her pain and, told her basically that I was a bad doctor for having her on so much OxyContin, even though that was the teaching at the time. Her husband, who questioned her pain in the first place, and they had a rocky relationship, subsequently reported me to the State Board of Medicine. I found out later, after all this went down, that the State Board of Medicine had a political agenda. They were looking to set an example of someone prescribing opioids and wanted to post my head on a stake and parade me around town for all to see. This is what happens to you if you prescribe opioids. To do so, they hired a, quote, expert, end quote, witness who had done 1 year of a family practice internship in the 1960s. He did no residency. He had no training in rheumatology, and he made his living testifying against doctors. He reviewed my chart and made at least 25 errors of fact in his report. Now, we can talk about errors of opinion, where I say I start a patient on 20 milligrams of a dosage, and he says you should only start the dosage at 5 milligrams. That's a difference of opinion, and you can argue who's right or wrong. But when he says you should start the patient on 5 milligrams of medicine, and I was remiss in not doing that, and my chart documents that I did start the patient on 5 milligrams, that is an error of fact. He misinterpreted the facts. He said I didn't have a history of physical in the chart. I didn't document fibromyalgic tender points. 25 errors in the chart. We pointed this out to the State Board of Medicine. They didn't care. They needed someone to testify to what they wanted to testify, and the facts were not going to get in the way of this. In fact, I wrote an article on this case in 2017, which was published in the Journal of Medical Practice Management. And the title of the argument was, "The Facts Didn't Matter." They weren't interested in the facts. So I was up against someone who was literally lying to make a point. The most telling thing that happened to me was at the trial, a couple things. One, he was on the stand for a day and a half as our attorney asked him questions. I was on the stand for only 20 minutes because every question they asked me, I had an answer to, and they wanted to get me off the stand. But the most striking thing and the most lesson I learned about this was at the trial, I met this man for the first time, and he extended his hand to me, and by default, I took his hand and shook it. I've regretted that moment ever since. How could I take the hand of someone who was out to destroy me without regard for the truth. And
well, I think probably because you're a decent person. That's what decent people do.
But I learned that civilities should not be the default behavior when someone morally does not deserve them. And I learned from that, and it made me much stronger in terms of my own assertiveness, in terms of not just engaging in civil behaviors with people who are just unethical, which is what this man was. Again,
well,
I needed more counseling to get through this.
Yeah, I bet you did. I'm curious, how does one earn a seat on the Board of Medicine in Pennsylvania? I'm really surprised at the behavior of this group, given, the facts. Do you have any idea?
I don't know
where
that
they come from and why they get there?
I can tell you it's not all doctors. There are lawyers on the board.
Oh, dear.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that they were not interested in the facts. And interestingly, there was legislation passed in Pennsylvania in 2003, which would have made this case unacceptable. The expert witness did not have the proper criteria. He was not board certified in my specialty. He was not seeing patients. He was not qualified to testify. And we called the state board on that and said, we don't have to follow those guidelines. This isn't a malpractice suit. So they were totally uninterested in anything fair or the truth. In terms of this, they were trying to get their point across about prescribing opioids.
Yeah, I'm completely blown away by that reality, that they were just, it appears there was no attempt to be fair at all. And the other thing is that you and I both know that there are scores of physicians who, in fact, are bad guys that are out there doing the wrong thing day in and day out, and the evidence to expose them is readily available, and yet they chose to pick on you. Has the state board in Pennsylvania changed at all since that time, or is it pretty much the same bunch of...
I can't answer that.
I won't say what I think.
I can't answer that for sure. I do know that this was a political game for them. This case fell into their laps as something they were trying to do, and I found that out from one of my political cohorts who was very knowledgeable about the state board and informed me of such. They were trying to make a point. They weren't going to let the facts get in their way.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Crow, founder and CEO for MD Coaches. Here on RX for Success, we interview a lot of great medical professionals on how they grew their careers, how they overcame challenges, and how they handle day-to-day work. I really hope you're getting a lot of great information. But if you're looking for an answer to a specific problem, management or administration challenge, or if you're feeling just a bit burnt out, like maybe you chose the wrong career, well, then there's a faster way to get the help you need. No, it's not counseling, it's coaching. RX for Success is produced by MD Coaches, a team of physicians who have been where you are. I know you're used to going it alone, but you don't have to. Get the support you need today. Visit us at mymdcoaches.com to schedule your complimentary consultation. Again, that's mymdcoaches.com, because you're not in this alone.
We'll get back to our interview in just a moment, but right now I want to tell you a little bit about Physician Outlook. If you haven't discovered this remarkable magazine, please do so very soon. It was created by physicians, for physicians, to showcase the intersection between clinical and non-clinical interests, whether it's writing, painting, cooking, politics, and dozens of other topics. Physician Outlook gives a physician perspective. It's available online and in print. It's really unique among physician lifestyle magazines. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook amplifies the voice of any physician who has something to say. It also engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get 3 months free when you enter our promo code RX for Success and select the monthly option at checkout. That's a really great deal on this stunning publication. And now let's get back to today's interview. Well, that is terribly unfortunate, and I'm grateful to you, and all physicians should be grateful to you for exposing the fact that these sorts of things go on, because it's something that we all should be well informed about, and we should be very angry about it. And with that as a segue, at least as I interpret your writing in Room for Improvement, that was the real launch button for your entry into the world of activism. Am I correct about that?
Actually, the second lawsuit was, but this just amplified it that much more. I mean, this was like a crucible I went through, and I came out galvanized on the other side. The old expression, that which does not kill you makes you stronger. I came out stronger. And I came out more outspoken, more assertive, and more willing to speak my mind about the things that were wrong in medicine. Throughout the 2000s, up until 2010, the main issue was tort reform, and I spoke quite a bit about that. But then other issues began to take precedence over tort reform in Pennsylvania. Prior auth issues, maintenance of certification, scope of practice, surprise billing, venue, etc. And I became very active speaking out on a number of these issues, both in writing articles and in lecturing and so forth.
And can you tell us maybe a couple, maybe 2 or 3 instances where you were actually able to see that you were actually having an impact?
Individually, it's tough in that regard.
Yeah, I know.
You have to throw it up against the wall. I have one voice. This is kind of like Horton Hears a Who. You have to have everybody shouting out. But I mean, some examples occur in maintenance of certification. The American Board of Internal Medicine has made some changes to their program, which are beneficial. They still have not gone far enough, and I still am very outspoken against them. But they have made some changes for the better. They just need to go further. There's legislation looking at prior authorization. People are aware of prior authorization. Legislators are more aware of pharmacy benefit managers and the conflict of interest that they have in terms of drug prices. So it's publicizing all this and making people aware of it. But there are tremendous lobbies on the other side, the insurance lobby, arguing against changes to prior authorization. And there's a tremendous back and forth with the idea of keeping doctors in their place as corporate entities try to control the healthcare dollar.
Well, speaking of keeping doctors in their place, so to speak, I know that one of the bullet points in your section on revolution is scope of practice, which is something that is creating a lot of interest amongst physicians, I'm learning. And I would like for you to go ahead and elaborate on that a little bit, kind of define the problem for us and tell us what we should be doing.
Scope of practice looks primarily at the practice of nurse practitioners and whether or not they should be able to practice without the supervision of a physician. 24 states have allowed this with the idea that there's a physician shortage and that nurse practitioners can fill the gap. Nurse practitioners have pushed the agenda that they can practice medicine as well as a physician. On the one hand, they say they can practice as well as a physician. On the other hand, they say they're not practicing medicine, they're practicing advanced nursing. And they want to talk about being able to practice at the top of their field. The problem is that the training for nurse practitioners is much different than for physicians. Whereas by the time a physician finishes residency, he's engaged in approximately 12 to 15,000 hours of clinical care. A nurse practitioner only requires 500 hours of clinical time to meet their requirements, which if you think about it is a 40-hour week for 3 months is all that takes. And so they don't have the quantity of training that a physician has. Furthermore, nurse practitioners, when they go to nursing school, are trained in nursing, not in medicine, and they're completely different disciplines. One is not better than the other, but they're different. Nurses tend to look at the whole patient. They look at their resources. They look at their support system. They look at them more holistically than physicians do, because physicians are trained more in terms of the diagnosis of disease, the pathophysiology of disease, and the treatment of disease. We need both of them to optimally take care of patients. One does not replace the other. And nurse practitioners are saying that they are equivalent to physicians, and it's not true based on the quality of training and the quantity of training. They quote a number of studies which show equality, but these are all for nurse practitioners who are working under the supervision of physicians. And, when you look at some of the things that are looked at, do nurse practitioners check hemoglobin A1Cs as well as doctors? Yes, they do. There's no reason for a diabetic patient that a nurse practitioner can't check hemoglobin A1Cs as well as a physician can. The question is, are they going to be able to pick up on the diagnosis of diabetes in the first place as easily as a physician? And, the nurse practitioner would argue yes. The physicians would argue no. Interestingly, if nurse practitioners do get independent practice, and they're pushing for it in Pennsylvania, it would be under the auspices of the Board of Nursing, not the Board of Medicine. So they want to do everything that the physician does, but they want to call it nursing. And the hypocrisy is just stunning in that regard. So for all the arguments, the basic argument is simple. 500 hours does not equal 15,000. And this is really a common sense issue, but a lot of people, corporate entities, are pushing for independence for nurse practitioners because they can then hire them without having to hire a doctor. They can still see patients. They can still reap the benefits of seeing patients, but they don't have to pay as much. So you've got entities like Minute Clinics at CVS. You've got hospitals who are pushing for nurse practitioners who are cheaper to employ than physicians. So a lot of this is geared towards the corporate practice of medicine. How can we provide medical care as inexpensively as possible? But the question is that medical care equivalent to the medical care that would be provided by doctors? My response is no, it's not.
And you've been very vocal in your opposition to that movement, and you've been very vocal about a lot of things. You have been very involved, and it's worth it to read your book, Room for Improvement, just as an opportunity to find out how many opportunities are available for physicians to make themselves heard. And that, as I say, that alone is a good enough reason to read the book, and I highly recommend it. I would like to give you a chance before we close it out to talk about part 3 of your book, the resolution, where you get into some of your ideas about how we make things better.
Well, the way we make things better is we have to focus on the patient. Healthcare is not focused on the patient right now. It's focused on the populations and how can we, patients are widgets. One of the main themes of this book is that healthcare should be a human endeavor between a patient and their physician rather than a business transaction between a consumer and a provider. And I point out even the use of the word provider is meant to diminish physicians to make them, equivalent to those with less training. It's all the same. It doesn't matter. There's no accounting for the different skills that different professions within the healthcare community have. Nurses are different than physicians. Physical therapists are different than physicians. And if you lump them all together, you negate the unique qualities of each one in terms of providing unique care to an individual patient. So the main thing that physicians need to do is they need to raise their voices. And this is very difficult. Apathy has set in. There is a learned helplessness amongst the physician community where many physicians feel like, why bother? There's nothing we can do. It's been written. It's already, sealed what's going to happen, and we can't change it. And my response to that is, yeah, if you don't say anything. The quote I like to use has been attributed to Michael Jordan and to Wayne Gretzky, and it says, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And as I say, I will go to my deathbed knowing I may not have accomplished anything in affecting change, but I will know that at least I went up to bat and took my swings. I may strike out, but that's much better than being afraid to step into the batter's box in the first place. And I encourage all physicians to speak out, to your legislators, to write articles for the newspaper, letters to the editor. I've discovered that insurance companies and others hate the publicity of what they're doing. They don't want patients to know what they're doing. The push for transparency is being resisted by hospitals and pharmaceutical companies who have actually sued to prevent transparency. Corporate powers that be don't want patients to know what's going on, and they don't want physicians to know what's going on. And we have to shout it from the rooftops and make people aware of it. So that's what I point out, in the book, some of the areas that we can talk about. Transparency is key. Education is key. Education is a problem right now because of the political world we're in. Trust has gone out the window. So the question is, who do you trust? And the idea is most people trust the individual person that they deal with, whether it be their doctor, their accountant, their lawyer. They may speak generally about doctors, accountants, and lawyers, but they trust their own individual one. So it's up to doctors to push this message, even if it's not through legislators, to their patients, one at a time, to explain to them what's going on in healthcare and what they can do. Only if we raise our voices do we have a shot at making meaningful change. The other thing in resolution that I talk about is the humanity of medicine. And it's easy to lose track of that when you're restricted and you only have 15 minutes to see a patient and you've got all this paperwork to fill out and you've got to document all this unnecessary stuff. It's easy to lose track of the idea that healthcare is inherently a human profession. We're dealing with people, their faults, their foibles, their flaws, their strengths, our own flaws. And we need to recognize that. And if we can recognize that, healthcare will be better for all of us.
Mark, I really love that term that you invented. Actually, I don't know if you invented it or not, but I'm going to ascribe it to you every time I use it, and that is learned helplessness.
No, that doesn't come from me.
I think that describes physicians exactly. We're trained in the sciences, we're trained in the healing arts, but we get no training whatsoever in dealing with conflict, and it really has put us in a very vulnerable situation. And the way you have written about it is brilliant. I can tell you, I have found it nearly impossible to put this book down. I have not quite finished it entirely, but what I have read is quite compelling. It's called Rheum for Improvement. And by the way, the Rheum is RHEUM, which I just love, that little pun. Rheum for Improvement, The Evolution of a Healthcare Advocate by Dr. Mark Lopatin. Mark, I've really enjoyed our conversation. And what I would like to do at this point is step out of the way and let you have the floor for yourself. So I'm going to close my mic and sit quietly. And Dr. Mark Lopatin is going to give us his personal prescriptions for success.
Before I do that, I have to give credit to where it's due. The expression learned helplessness comes from Dr. Martin Seligman, who was one of my psychology professors in college, and he used learned helplessness as a model for depression, stating that when you learn that your actions don't have an effect, it's identical to what people experience in depression. So I got to give props to him in that regard. As far as my prescriptions for success, one is to create realistic expectations for yourself and your patients. That means in telling patients what they can expect from a treatment or a diagnostic test or whatever, make it realistic, because patients are going to suffer if they expect too much. And many patients have been told by the media and so forth to expect perfect health care, 100% solutions to all their problems at no cost with no risks, and that's unrealistic. We also have to set realistic expectations for ourselves. We are human as physicians. We need bathroom breaks, we need food, and we put tremendous expectations upon ourselves to solve every problem all the time for every patient. That's not realistic. Two, we have to recognize that healthcare is inherently a human endeavor. We have to be conscious of the emotions of our patients and conscious of our own emotions, the things that we do well and we don't do well, and recognize that we are not going to be able to achieve 100% efficacy in everything we do, and we have to be able to forgive ourselves. A third thing that was really important for me is to get help when you need it, whether that be asking a colleague for advice on a case or getting counseling help for the emotional aspects that we deal with. That is very important. It's taboo in our society. We're afraid to do it. I've done it twice. It was very beneficial to me. I wouldn't be where I am today without that counseling. So I encourage people to not be afraid to get help when they need it. And the last thing is what I call is make sure you're aware of the sleep test. And the sleep test, the typical example of it is when I get a phone call at 11 o'clock at night for a patient who wants advice, and I'm debating, do I send them to the emergency room or not? Can this be managed, with just medicines or whatever, or wait till the morning? I ask myself the question, if I give them this particular piece of advice, am I going to be able to fall asleep again? Or am I going to be sitting there worried about it? And that's not just at nighttime. It comes during the day when you give advice and you look back at what you said. Do I feel comfortable with this advice? And I guess a simpler way to put this is trust your gut instinct. In terms of what feels right and what doesn't feel right, because your gut instinct most of the time is going to lead you in the right direction. So those are the tips that I would have. Those would be my prescriptions for success.
Well, Mark, those are very wise and well described and enlarged upon very nicely in what I think is one of the best books, maybe the best book that I have come across so far with respect to the subject of surviving as a practitioner of medicine in the United States. I promise you, audience, if you read it, you will see yourself all over the place, and it is really worth the time. So thank you so much for that, Mark. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for your kind words.
You're so welcome. And I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience, you can tell them one more time about where to find the book and those sorts of things, and also where to find you, whether it be on social media or whatever you would like to share.
The book is available on Amazon. It's also available at Barnes & Noble. I am on Twitter. I am on at Lopatin MD. I am on Facebook. My email is mlopatin@comcast.net. I'd love to hear from people. I'd love to hear what people think of the book. I welcome input, and I hope people will spread the word, because we, as physicians, we need to open our mouths and shout from the rooftops what's happening to our profession. Our profession is being destroyed, and we have to do everything we can in our power to prevent that. The patients are the ones who are going to suffer if that happens.
Well, I have to say, you can not only find Mark on social media and the usual places, but you can probably find him from time to time in newspapers and on television and mass media of that sort, because he's making a difference and people are paying attention. And we're grateful for that, Mark. And I'm really grateful for you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. As always, we really appreciate a review from you, and a 5-star rating helps us a lot. These ratings give our show much more visibility, and they help us reach more listeners. And if you'd like access to exclusive content, head on over to our Patreon page, where you can see membership-only material, including rapid-fire Q&A sessions with our guests and more. Never want to miss a future episode? Visit our website at rxforsuccesspodcast.com to subscribe, and while you're there, you can offer your very own prescription for success. As always, special thanks to Ryan Jones, who created and performs our theme music for the show. And remember, be sure and fill your prescription for success with my next episode.